situation where our policy is in shambles. Now, Taibbi also shared that Twitter executives conducted weekly meetings with federal officials, including the FBI, DHS, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. James Baker, who served as Twitter's Deputy General Counsel, was fired by Musk. Baker had formerly served as General Counsel for the FBI. Now, critics of the file dump have pointed out that Twitter's own terms of service state that they can, quote, limit distribution or visibility of any content on the service. And the White House says it is up to private companies to make these kinds of decisions. Shannon.
Alexandria Hoff reporting in Washington. Alexandria, thank you. Joining us now, Admiral John Kirby, the coordinator for strategic communications at the National Security Council. Welcome back to Fox News Sunday, Admiral.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be with you this morning.
Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, you had a conversation with my colleague Martha McCallum. It was in the context of Apple and what it's doing in China. You said this: we aren't in the business of telling private companies how to execute their initiatives. But it appears from these revelations from inside of Twitter, there were regular meetings between executives there, the FBI, DHS, the DNI. Flagging tweets, it seems, trying to drive certain conversations. So should or shouldn't the federal government, federal agencies, in your words, be directing private companies on how to execute their initiatives?
We aren't directing private social media companies on how to manage their content. These are decisions that they have to make as appropriate. Now, look, we obviously don't want to see the public square polluted with hate speech and disinformation. That's not a good use of the information environment for the American people. But it's up to these social media companies to determine how they're going to manage their content, how they are going to deliver that content to their users.
But how much pushback ability do they have if the federal government, an agency like the FBI, is calling them up and saying, we don't like these specific tweets and think you should take action, and then they do, it appears?
Well, without speaking to that hypothetical situation, again, these are private companies, and they have to make these decisions based on their own policies, their own initiatives, and we respect that.
Okay, let's talk about the big news this week between Victor Boot, the illegal arms merchant who was convicted of a number of things, was on a sentence here in the U.S., and he was traded for great relief that she is home. But there are questions about exactly what went down there. NBC initially had reporting that said the White House was given a choice between Paul Whelan, a U.S. Marine who's being held on espionage charges by Russia, and Brittany Griner, or no one. They said it was a misstatement. They corrected it later to say that it was either Brittany Griner or no one. Can you unequivocally say that there was never an option between Paul Whelan or Brittany Griner?
Yes, ma'am, I can. There was never a choice posed by the Russians, well, hey, you give us Boot back, and then you can decide whether you want Brittany or Paul. That was never the arrangement. It was only Miss Griner for Mr. Boot. They treat Paul differently, Shannon, because of these sham espionage charges. He is put in a special category by the Russians. And try as we might, and believe me, Shannon, we did. Right up until the very end, we were making efforts to try to get both of them out. There was just no way to get there. So it was either make this deal now and at least get one of them home and keep up the efforts to get Paul home, and that's where we are right now.
I want to ask about Mark Fogel because he's a U.S. teacher. He's taught in Russia for, I think, more than a decade, roughly a decade or so. He was taken into custody in August of last year, also coming through an airport there, had medical marijuana with him that was prescribed by a doctor because of injuries and surgeries that he's been through. He's been sentenced to 14 years. He obviously doesn't have the name recognition or the celebrity of a Brittany Griner, but he's been held on similar charges for longer than she has. Why wasn't he part of this conversation or this deal?
There's a limit in this particular case about what I can say publicly. I can tell you we're obviously mindful of this, of course, but there are some constraints here in terms of what we can say publicly. I could just broadly say that when it comes to wrongful detentions of Americans around the world, overseas, whether it's Russia or anywhere else, we're going to work as hard as we can to get them home.
Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, had this to say. He chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Russians and other regimes that take American citizens hostage cannot pretend that there is equivalence between the Brittany Griners of the world and people like Victor Boot, the so-called merchant of death. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we cannot ignore that releasing Bout back into the world is a deeply disturbing decision. Reaction out there from one of the former DEA regional directors who was part of putting him away found it astounding that he would be released. What kind of message does this send to our enemies, to bad actors out there who think if they've got an American, especially with any level of celebrity, they could get someone back like the, quote, merchant of death?
Sadly, this is a common tactic by Mr. Putin. We've seen this before. That's why the president has put in place additional accountability measures, visa restrictions, other sanctions that will give us a little bit more influence and ability to affect the decision making of potential hostage takers. We've also included on the State Department website, for every country you want to visit, there's now a new designation which will let you know what the detention risk is if you want to travel to a country, whether it's for business or pleasure. So we urge Americans, if you're going to travel overseas, go look at that so you go fully informed. But know this, that even if you do everything right, and even if hostage takers are not dissuaded, that the United government is going to do everything we can, if you're wrongfully detained overseas, to get you back home. And that might mean making some tough decisions, like the one the president just made. But in the end, the president believed it was the right thing to do to get to Brittany Griner back home. And of course there's no equivalence. She wasn't guilty of anything. It was a sham trial to begin with. Mr. Bout obviously was guilty on very serious charges.
Well, including charges that he would sell to terrorists and other people that would freely go around and happily kill Americans. So you can imagine there's a great deal of worry about him being released back out into the mainstream. We've seen what's happened with some of the people we've traded in deals that have ended up back on the battlefront or left behind.
We'll, of course, cooperate fully with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. If there's a need and a desire for more information, we'll be as forthcoming as we absolutely can be. Of course, we respect the role of Congress. A couple of points. Mr. Bout was serving a life sentence, Shannon. He was going to get out in 2029. So at some point in the not-too-distant future, he would have been a free man. It is 6 years earlier. Nobody over at the White House is doing backflips of joy that he is walking the streets, but this was the deal we could get. Now was the moment we could get it. We're obviously going to look after our national security going forward, and Mr. Bout has choices to make. And if he chooses to get back into that line of work, then we're going to do everything we can to hold him properly accountable, as we have in the past. We did a national security assessment. We believe that whatever risk there is was manageable and okay to make this deal.
All right, well, the world will be watching. Admiral, thank you very much for your time. Always good to see you.
Yes, ma'am.
Joining us now, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a Fox News contributor. Secretary, welcome back. Thank you for joining us today. I want to talk to you about this report by John Bolton, a former colleague of yours in the Trump administration, who says that there was talk of a boot for wheeling trade under the Trump administration. CIA director, you were Secretary of State, certainly you would have to know about those discussions. Is that true, and why wasn't the deal made?
Shannon, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I don't want to talk about the private conversation we had in Basketball Free and say whatever he might like, but we were very focused on getting Paul Whelan, not every American, back home. There was nothing in my time in service that was as joyous as returning Americans home to the family. We got 3 Americans out of North Korea. I got to fly back with them. It was remarkable. We got Pastor Brunson out. And I'm glad Brittany Griner's back home, too. They were able to accomplish this. But my mission was always to get every American back, but at the same time not create the risk that more Americans would be taken in. There is no doubt that today, not just Vladimir Putin, but all the bad guys, the Iranians, others who hold Americans in detention, say that if you take a celebrity, the chance of getting one of your bad guys back out of American control is greater. And I think for people out there who have notoriety, it is more likely they will be taken hostage today, and that is not a good policy.
Is John Bolton telling the truth?
I don't want to comment on our internal discussions. We were working hard on each of the cases, including Paul Whelan's case during my time in service. And we were talking with the Russians at multiple levels. Our ambassador on the ground there in Russia, John Sullivan, was working with them. There were lots of discussions about what the right mechanism for it was. But the Trump administration was always very clear. We work to trade bad guys for because it creates the wrong incentives for the bad guys as we go forward. It's not good for American national security. It's not good for people who are traveling across the world.
Okay, Paul Whelan's brother David is speaking out. He says he's very happy for Brittany Griner and her loved ones, but their family is devastated. He says we should think about taking, quote, more law-breaking, Kremlin-connected Russians into custody. It says start roping in their citizens in order to facilitate these trades, or is that a fair strategy?
I can only imagine what the Whelan family is experiencing today. I pray for them. I pray for all to get home just as quickly as we can. But we can't engage in behaviors like that where we pull people like Brittany Griner, who may have broken some Russian law, I don't know, but who certainly didn't do anything that warranted the conviction that they brought upon her. It was pure politics, pure extortion on behalf of Vladimir Putin. We shouldn't engage in that. We should take down, bring into our custody folks like Victor Boot, who broke in U.S. law and who put American lives at risk with his actions. But we shouldn't be engaged in the hostage taking that we see take place around the world. We're a nation of laws. We're a nation that the Constitution governs. This matters. When we get it right, we'll not only have the moral high ground, but we'll keep more American people safe as well, Shannon.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of names and people around the world that I know that you've worked on and that this administration is working on as well. We'll keep track of those. I want to look domestically now. The House has passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and one of the key measures they insisted on Republicans did was repealing the vax mandate. In that measure, it's got to go over to the Senate now. The Washington Post reports it this way: rollback of COVID vaccine mandate met with furor at Pentagon. And the piece quotes an unnamed Navy officer. He says this makes him look like a clown. It undermines his credibility to go before his men and women and say, you got to follow me on this very unpopular command that I'm going to give you. You understand military leadership and how important that is. How do you respond to those concerns?
Shannon, look what they did with this vaccine mandate. They took this vaccine that we now know that you can't get to zero. The Chinese can't get to zero. We couldn't get to zero in our schools. And they put this burden on the American soldiers, American sailors, American airmen that didn't make sense for the forces. And it drove people who were protecting us, people who raised their right hand to go to a recruiting station, to be part of the American armed forces, and put it on these young men and women. It was an enormous mistake. I'm glad that the Republicans have now, it appears, managed to get this out of U.S. law. But there's a lot more to do. We should go back and fix the wrongs that were done to people who refused the vaccine previously. The military should focus on the things that matter most. They're missing recruitment goals in staggering numbers, Shannon. This is bad for America, and it's because they're foisting some of these progressive woke ideologies into our military and not focusing on the mission, which is deter the bad guys.
And there are plenty of them out there. Let's talk about China. They have been on the radar for a long time, certainly were during your involvement in the Trump administration. They are now. President Xi, post-COVID, at least whatever version they have of post-COVID there in China, is definitely out there making the rounds. He's meeting with leaders, having conversations, Germany, Egypt. He was out in Saudi Arabia this week. The headline from Foreign Policy is, Xi's Saudi visit shows Riyadh's monogamous marriage to Washington is over. How concerned are you about him developing these relationships with places like the Saudis, which obviously we have a lot of things we can discuss with respect to their relationship with the U.S., but Xi wants to, it seems, horn in on that.
Shannon, when you won't be partners with your friends and your allies, and you offend them, and you simply won't do anything to push back against your adversaries like Xi Jinping, you see exactly this kind of hedging behavior. Shannon, we, for the first time, we upended 40 years of American policy and recognized that the Chinese Communist Party was the singular greatest external threat to the United States of America. And when we did that, our friends and partners around the world joined along with us. In the Quad and Southeast Asia, our partners here all came to see it the same way. This administration came in, they called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they said Zayed was a pariah. And when you do those things, you will hurt the American people all across this country. What you see happen in the kingdom this week is a direct result of bad American policy. You got to stick with your friends, you got to stay with your partners, and you must put back against your adversaries, or your friends will begin to hedge. They'll go make friendships to protect themselves if they can't count on America to be a good partner and friend around the world.
Well, and we have talked about how complicated that friendship is and real concerns that there are about Saudi human rights abuses. We can continue that conversation, but I want to make sure to hit a couple of domestic issues with you. You're apparently in a thing with Randy Weingart, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. She says that he called her the most dangerous person in the world, and then writes this in the New York Post. What's truly outrageous are the other things he said, calling what educators do, quote, filth and, quote, propaganda, and in doing so, he personally insulted the nation builders of the very American democracy he claims to cherish. She says she won't debate you, but she'll invite you to come visit schools with her. Will you go?
Happy to go to a school with her. Then we should immediately head to the debate stage to share with the American people what the teachers unions are doing to our kids. Shannon, it's disastrous. She wanted to keep the schools closed until we got to zero COVID. She said that if we didn't teach our kids, little kids, about sex in the schools, that this was going to create a civil war in America. She's attempted personal attacks on me and on so many others who simply want our kids to learn to read, to write, to be creative, to think logically. We don't want to foist woke ideology into our schools. The teachers unions have now undermined American education. I called her out for that, and we ought to have this debate. No need to attack me, no need to attack her. Let's talk about what we're going to teach our kids, why America is a great country, and we shouldn't teach in our schools that it's a racist nation. Happy to have that debate and happy to tour a school. My son went to public school, my wife is a Wichita State graduate. I'm a product of public education. I'm happy to go to a school, be with her, and let's share with the American people why it is what the teachers unions and Randy Weingart in particular are doing to our kids.
Okay, so we've brokered the school visit, and if you guys want to debate afterwards, we're happy to host that as well. Okay, you tweeted this on Thursday. As I've said before, I'm tired of losing. So are most Republicans. It's past time to show voters that we're ready to lead. This comes after the loss of the Georgia Senate race that was ongoing. Who do you blame for the losses, and are you raising your hand to be the new leader of the Republicans heading into 24?
Well, I hope every conservative want to be leading what is the grand old party, the GOP. We lost too many races. We had candidates that wouldn't defend the things that mattered most. Candidates that won were serious, they were thoughtful, they articulated a vision for taking America forward. They didn't focus on the past. They defended the things that matter most, the things about America that we're fighting for. And when our candidates did that, they won. And when they were unable to do that, when they talked about rearward-looking ideas, they almost always lost. And I'm tired of losing. I wish we had control of that. As president of the White House, I'm counting on us getting both of those back in 2024. And I'm certainly going to be around to do my part to try and help make sure that we get that. This isn't liberal or conservative. This is about America, and we got to get it right.
So about that, you're doing your part. I think you will be as part of 24. You visited all the right states. You've got booked out. You are speaking all around the country. When will you announce your intentions for 2024?
Oh, Shannon, I don't know. We're still thinking our way. Since the debate, my wife, we're thinking our way through this, trying to figure out.
Clock is ticking.
Yeah, I know. The clock is ticking, but we have to make sure we get this right for America. It's not about the pump hand. And this is about getting this right for the country. We got to make sure we do that. And I'm confident that the country will get it right come 2024.
What's your timeline?
Sometime in the spring, Shannon, you'll know.
On a Sunday, right here on Fox News Sunday. All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, ma'am. Have a good morning.
You too. Up next, Democrats walked away with a big win in Georgia's runoff, bolstering their majority in the Senate. But now, a key Democrat swing vote in the Senate says she's leaving the party. We'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss when we return.
The soulful spirit of the season is Holiday Soul. With R&B Christmas classics from back in the day. Holiday Soul on now, Christmas Day. Listen anytime and anywhere on the SXM app, included in all trials and popular plans. Are you kidding me? Gas prices are up again. Somebody has to do something. Well, someone did. That's why I use Upside. Upside? What's that? It's a free app that pays you back real money for every gallon of gas or diesel you buy. I just earned 25 cents back for every gallon in this tank. Hold on. So the Upside app is free and you actually get cash back every time you use it? No strings attached? Yep, it's awesome. Check it out. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up.
Instead of just watching your dollars go into your tank, start putting money back into your wallet with the free app from Upside. With the price of gas today, it's big news and big money. To cash out of your Upside cash, just transfer it to your bank account, PayPal, or a gift card. Upside users have already earned over $200 million. Now it's your turn. Download the free Upside app and get cash back on every gallon of gas. Use promo code ARMY for an extra 25 cents per gallon on your first fill-up. That's code ARMY. Use code ARMY for an extra 25 cents per gallon back in your first fill-up. Cashback's not available. Gas features in Wisconsin.
Do you find yourself stuck in a timeshare?